Thank you for joining today's webinar, an overview of RadSite MAP Standards version 3.1. We will be getting started in about a minute. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining RadSite's webinar, an overview of RadSite's MAP Standards version 3.1. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded, and an email containing the link will be sent to all registered participants early next week. To minimize noise and distraction, all attendees' phones have been muted. However, if you have a question or comment during the presentation, we encourage you to submit it using the question box in the section of the lower right side of your webinar portal ribbon. We will do our best to address all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Garry Carneal, RadSite President and CEO.
Hello, everybody. As Julie said, I'm Garry Carneal, and I've been RadSite's President and CEO for 10 years. Actually, November was my 10th anniversary. Hard to believe how time flies. I'm thrilled today to be able to moderate this webinar going over the latest round of changes that RadSite has made over the past year as we try to maintain our standards in the current capacity and meet regulatory and payer requirements, et cetera. So I think you're going to enjoy the webinar today as we move forward. So first, I'd like to introduce the speakers in order of presentation. And RadSite is very fortunate to have an extremely experienced and talented leadership team as part of its operations. First up today, we've Dr. Elliot Siegel. He serves as RadSite's Chief Strategy Officer and Standards Committee Chair. He obviously has helped oversee RadSite's standards development activities and product development initiatives also for the past decade. He also provides general guidance to RadSite, accreditation program and research initiatives and so on. Dr. Siegel is an internationally recognized radiologist who serves as a professor and vice chair at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He also works, he's the chief of radiology and nuclear medicine for the Veterans Affairs Maryland Healthcare Systems located in Maryland. And next up, we have Dr. Patrick Browning, who is RadSite's Chief Medical Officer. He joined us this summer. As the CMO, Dr. Browning oversees and promotes the integrity of all the quality-based programs and research initiatives that RadSite offers. He is an invaluable resource since he's in active practice to kind of give us reality checks as we develop the standards as well. Dr. Browning led to the creation of the Division of Medical Imaging for a portion of the Sutter Health Care System and has co-authored over a dozen peer-reviewed articles and has given numerous lectures around the United States. As I said, he remains in active practice in Northern California as a medical director for Open Imaging. He also has served as the CMO for 2 successful automated detection and artificial intelligence startups in the imaging arena and served in a leadership position at Magellan Health, where we first met him about 3 or 4 years ago. Next up, we have our Chief Physicist Officer, Dr. Phil Patton. He oversees, obviously, the technical requirements associated with RadSite's accreditation programs, and also for the past 10 years has helped us develop and implement standards related to RadSite's physics testing. Dr. Patton has conducted research in a wide variety of medical imaging and cancer treatment projects. He's also worked extensively to model and develop experimental measurements for doses received during high energy X-ray interrogation of cargo containers for homeland security applications and much, much more. Currently, he serves as the president and CEO of LPT Radiation Physics Consulting. And last but not least is Julie Irons. She serves as RadSite's Manager of Accreditation, and we've worked together for over 20 years. In her current role at RadSite, she manages all aspects of the applicant's experience and process, from initial contact to the application setup, review, and the awarding, hopefully, of the accreditation certificate at the end of the process. She does a lot of customer service support and brings to the table a lot of accreditation experiences I've referenced before. So just a couple quick, the overview of the webinar is we're going to really focus on RadSite's new standards, version 3.1, talking about some of the key updates, our launch of the new specialty modules, some of the updates to the professional requirements and the physics requirements, and talk about some of the recent upgrades to the accreditation review process. And then we'll talk about some new initiatives that are not directly related to the MIPPA accreditation program. Well, I should say Coping CT is. We're in the process of finalizing those standards, which Dr. Siegel will talk about. Talk a little bit about our work with the employer group National Alliance and RSNA's CUPA initiative, and then some comparative effectiveness research. And then with time remaining, hopefully we'll have some Q&A. So as many of you probably know, RadSite actually has been around for a total of 15 years. And I think one of the important things to note is prior to the MIPPA accreditation program, RadSite actually had a certification program that related to much of what MIPPA covers for both high-tech and low-tech imaging. In fact, we've accredited in that program over 60,000 imaging systems in 25,000 different provider locations. And as I mentioned before, briefly, I've actually been in the accreditation space for several decades and brought to market over 25 different accreditation programs. So the RadSite team, including me, provides a lot of leadership experience in terms of the accreditation process. And when you focus on the MIPPA accreditation programs, which the first set of standards were developed 9 years ago, and we were recognized by CMS about 7 years ago, you can see we've been working hard to keep the standards current to meet both CMS and private payer recognition requirements, and then also just to kind of keep things up to date as the field of imaging continues to change. And there are many different reasons to get accreditation. We obviously would like to think RadSite's best in class. We obviously offer a seal of approval. We really try to effectuate meaningful change with those companies that go through the accreditation process. We try to be respectful of your time and provide an efficient experience. And we hopefully, when an organization goes through our accreditation process, comes away being a better organization by updating its policy and procedures and just having a third party come in and do its quality and efficiency checks. And we just try to maintain things in a transparent fashion. One of my favorite things about RadSite is the fact that we have dozens and dozens of volunteers that serve on several committees. We have a traditional MIPPA accreditation program. We have a Chrome-Beam CT standards committee. So we have two standards committees, sorry. We have accreditation committee. We have board of managers, all that goes into kind of feeding the ecosystem of RadSite, which is mostly run by volunteers, which is always very rewarding. And then we try to promote different educational resources. For example, this webinar, as with all our webinars, are offered after the fact, either through the RadSite website or through our YouTube channel. I think this year, this may be our 9th or 10th webinar. We also try to publish a lot of blogs. And for example, if you're interested in these standards, you can download them at no charge off our website. So at this point, I'd like to turn over to Dr. Siegel, who will give you a little bit of an overview as to what we've been up to the past year in terms of updating the standards from version 3.0 to 3.1. Dr. Siegel.
Thanks, Garry. As you know, I've had a long-standing interest in quality and safety, and having the opportunity to head the standards committee for RadSite has allowed me to be able to look into how we can optimize quality and safety for our patients. And so one of the things that's been really interesting is that RadSite has probably, changed its standards to keep up with what's new and I think the times and current understanding of quality and safety more than any other accreditation organization that I know of. And so there have been lots of tremendous changes, and I'd just like to thank the standards committee for all of their valuable input and really thoughtful suggestions. Next slide, please. There it is. So as far as the highlights of the version of the standard 3.1, some of the things that we've done just in recent weeks have included, not only formatting updates, which we've done to make the document as consistent as possible throughout the many standards, but also added a number of new ones. One thing that's really important to emphasize is the fact that our standards have, with these revisions, only raised the bar as far as safety and quality. We've added a number of specialty modules at the request of a number of the folks who utilize RadSite for accreditation, and also our payers as well. And so this allows us to be able to look more intensely at particular areas of subspecialties within diagnostic imaging. We've also updated professional qualifications, and we'll be talking about that. And talking specifically about some of the new standards, we've created a crosswalk with the standards from Evacor, their 2020 Imaging Facility Network standards. We've also gotten a tremendous amount of input from Magellan in past years that have had an impact on our standards as well. One of the things that we particularly are interested in, and it may be partly because of my interest in physics and in patient safety and Dr. Patton's tremendous expertise, is we've updated our technical components of the standard as well. And I know that Phil's going to be talking about that. In looking at our overall standards, we've also deleted some of the background details that I thought might be extraneous to the standards, including, for example, an extensive background describing MR spectroscopy and artifacts that were probably more suited to a separate textbook or separate journal articles. And so in many ways, we've tried to streamline the standards. Thanks. As far as the specialty modules in version 3.1, there are modules that you would probably anticipate anatomically, such as CT and MR both have angiography and body imaging, cardiac imaging. CT has maxillofacial, and both CT and MR have neurologic as a specialty. MRI also has breast imaging as an area of subspecialty, and functional imaging as well. In nuclear medicine, we broke up planar and SPECT imaging into cardiac in general. And then for PET, we acknowledge that the majority of studies are oncology studies, but also added subspecialty modules in cardiac imaging, neurologic imaging, and also in imaging in patients with infection as well. Next, please.
Just real quickly, so just to be clear, Dr. Siegel, you can still apply for general accreditation for each modality, CT, MRI, nuke med. This is an optional additional overlay if you want to get more specific, similar to some of the other accreditation organizations out there. And as part of that process, Dr. Siegel, what do you have to do to kind of meet the more specific standards?
Yeah, so everybody would get essentially accredited generally for a particular modality, such as CT, MRI, PET imaging, or planar SPECT imaging. But in addition, one can be recognized specifically for one of these subspecialty areas by submitting cases in that subspecialty area. And then those cases are reviewed clinically with the images in the reports, and also there's a separate physics review of those as well. And so the idea is to drill significantly deeper into an area of subspecialty. Also, some of the subspecialty areas, such as cardiac CT or cardiac MR, require more specific guidelines with regard to image interpretation, and also specifically with regard to the equipment itself. For example, one needs at least a 64-channel scanner to do cardiac CT in the subspecialty area, and there are specific requirements for the injector, for CT cardiac imaging, and specific requirements for breast MRI and cardiac MR also. In addition to that requirement that the sites submit additional reports and additional images specifically in that subspecialty area. So thanks, Gary. Next slide, please. As far as the professional updates that I talked about, there are multiple standards that provide additional information and additional color about the professional requirements for these various studies in our standards. For example, the role of clinical director and supervising physician are more are detailed to a greater extent. We've also added experiential requirements, 90 category hours, 90 CMEs essentially every 3 years in general, and specifically 15 category 1 CMEs every 3 years for each specialty. As far as requirements for interpreting physicians, Dr. Browning is going to talk about that in more detail. We've also increased and updated the education and experience requirements, specialty qualifications for non-radiologist physicians. And then so there is a distinction that we make for qualifications for radiologists who have had certain baseline training that's mandatory, and then non-radiologist physicians who may not have had that same mandatory training as part of their subspecialty and specialty training. Also, we have deleted some of the third-party tables and references to specific acquisition techniques and referred to the published literature on that rather than trying to keep up with that on a every year basis. We also will talk a little bit about the imaging technologist and some of the updates we have for that position, and also have defined an MR scientist. And so the idea that MRI does not always require a physicist per se, but an MR scientist as a parallel recognized training pathway for one to be able to do the accreditation for the technical portion for MRI. We also now use the term imaging safety officer rather than radiation safety officer to take into account the fact that for MRI studies, for example, there are responsibilities to cover safety for non-radiation related issues, and have added some additional safety policies also. And standard 3.2.3 talks a little bit about the re-credentialing process. So thanks.
Yeah, as we turn it over to Dr. Browning, it's so interesting as someone who is not a clinician to kind of, you hear these issues, these tweaks, some of them substantive, some of them more, based on semantics, but these are very, very important discussions that kind of drive, I think, the practice of imaging. And in this case, as Dr. Browning will talk about, we had to kind of retool the non-physician interpreting physician, non-radiologist interpreting physician requirements based on some payer expectations, et cetera. So Dr. Browning?
Thanks so much, Garry. That's a great introduction. One of my passions is making sure that basically the right physician is reading the right study for the patient. Part of Magellan as being a radiologist, I've seen many situations where really a relatively unqualified person was interpreting images in ways that were not necessarily in the patient's best interest. So my passion as part of this RadSite process has been to work alongside Dr. Siegel and Dr. Patton on the technical and the physics side, which they've done an amazing job with, and with Garry and Julie in terms of organization, and try to contribute as much as I can to making sure that we're having qualified physicians reading the studies they should be reading, but not being so onerous that we're preventing people who are very highly qualified from being able to read a study, even though they may not be a radiologist. So as part of that, we've really redefined it into interpreting physician instead of just radiologists. And along the lines of the technology that we were talking about just a minute ago, we divided up into different subject areas, including CT and MR, general nuclear medicine, breast MR, which is a very specialized portion of MRI, cardiac MR, again, very specialized, and of course, cardiac nuke medicine and PET. Again, wanting to make sure that physicians are qualified, but not excluding otherwise qualified physicians is really sort of a balancing act. And so I think we have done a great job operating as a team with all the volunteers that Gary's brought together to come up with a really cohesive and consistent set of, I think, very reasonable requirements. So for general MR and CT and nukes, 100 supervised cases if you're not a radiologist, and then being physically present for 35% of them, 150 supervised cases for additional requirements for the more specialized study, making sure that we're tracking CME, making sure that there are appropriate certifications, and making sure that there's appropriate continuing education and experience. This is, I think, one of the most complete sets of requirements for interpreting physicians I've ever seen. It approaches all the facets of what radiologists and non-radiologists need to do to remain qualified. And I think personally we've done a great job. And as Garry said at the beginning, I think this is really best in class. Next slide. There we go. So moving on to the imaging technologist qualifications, we've added a number of new requirements, which I think, again, is very important because as non-radiologists begin to move into imaging and imaging interpretation, they need to be given high quality studies to be able to interpret, and the technologist is directly responsible for that. So we've asked the facilities to identify all the technologists and list their licenses, identify lead technologists. There are many facilities that just have regular technologists. Nobody's taking the leadership role, and making sure they're getting the appropriate additional certification. And then again, for highly specialized studies like cardiac imaging, making sure that they have the initial and required continuing education and additional certification for it. I think our baseline requirements are new, but very much improved. Being able to do the appropriate number of scans, being able to make sure they're continuing to educate themselves, and making sure that they have ongoing experience that I personally think as a radiologist is incredibly important to making sure you're putting out a high quality product for the patient and the clinician. Next slide. So quality assurance, as Dr. Siegel mentioned, that can be a moving target. It's always changing as we discover more about imaging and more about imaging safety. So we made many other updates in the 3.1 software, or sorry, 3.1 accreditation. Cardiac imaging, breast images, CT colonoscopy have been split out. There are performance requirements for MR and nuclear medicine. That's a small typo in the MRI, should be 2.3.3. ADI software requirements. Software is constantly being upgraded and changed. It's really important that we ensure that the latest and best software is being used. And then also coming up with a better framework, a better assessment framework, as you can see in the right-hand column, and making sure that we're looking at specialty examinations, image requirements, scan parameters, image section, and we review all these on a very regular basis to make sure that facilities are maintaining their quality and maintaining their ability to provide the best imaging possible. Again, I think RadSite does the best job of this to date, and I say that from my position as VP and Medical Director for Specialty Services for Magellan. Comparing the different imaging quality assurance networks and providers, I think RadSite is the best. And I always choose to go with the best when I'm a CMO. So next slide.
Well, thank you, Dr. Browning. Before we turn it over to Dr. Patton to talk a little about the physics, I just want to make a comment as someone who is the person who helps work with this amazing team to do the drafting. The new imaging quality assessment framework, that's the standard structure. And one of the things we did from in 3.1 is we really standardized each of the image quality assessment protocols and processes as part of section 7 of the standards with this layout. And as Dr. Siegel alluded, one of the things is we're now drawing clinical protocols from the evidence-based protocols, such as from ACR and elsewhere, versus relying on our own protocols. We don't have to keep updated. So I think it's always wonderful to try to continue improving the standards. And I think that we've been doing this now for years. We're really kind of honing in and trying to get things clarified in our standards. You have the actual standards, and then you have the interpretive guide section that kind of talks about what we're trying to get at those standards. And then we have the documentation section, talks about if there's any documentation beyond filling out the RadSite portal, which Julie will talk about in a minute. But Dr. Browning and Dr. Siegel, would one of you just take a minute about what is the process for submitting images as part of Section 7, the quality assessment process? What does an applicant do and how is it scored, et cetera, just so they're aware of that?
I'm the new kid on the block, so I will leave that to Dr. Siegel, who's muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, so the process of submitting images is pretty straightforward at this point. We are utilizing a third-party vendor, and one has the capability of being able to upload images from a CD or upload images in another way directly to that third-party vendor along with the radiology report and accompanying information, including clinical information. And so once the data are, images are uploaded, then we have a radiologist who reviews those images with familiarity or identical subspecialty training in that area. And those images are reviewed specifically for the quality of the study, whether or not the information required is included in the study, whether the protocol is appropriate to the indication of the study, whether all the anatomic areas are included, and whether or not it's a clinically reasonable and practical protocol. And then in addition to that, then there's an assessment of the quality of the images and an assessment of the quality of the report and whether the report is appropriate for the images and details the major things that should be included in a report. And so overall, I think this is something that's unique to RadSite also. Not only is there the physics assessment of the images, but there are also a clinically oriented assessment of the images that looks at the images from a clinical perspective and looks at the imaging report. And so there's been a lot of feedback actually from some of the experts who've reviewed these studies with suggestions for improvements to the protocol, improvements to the report, and even an occasional comment about the report itself, which the feedback that we've gotten has been really positive towards those. And so as part of the educational mission, it's been great, you know, not only to have Dr. Patton be able to comment on the physics and comment on how to optimize the image quality, but also on the reports and report contents themselves. And so I think that's a really important area to underscore. And the process of submitting those images is easy. It's also HIPAA compliant with the third party that we use that subspecializes in HIPAA compliant transfer of images. And then those images stay on that third party site as we review the studies to make sure that they maintain that high level of security and privacy and HIPAA compliance. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Siegel. So that's one element of the review process. Another important part is the physics review. So I'll turn over to Dr. Patton, who will give us an update on kind of what we've done to date and some of the tweaks we made with version 3.1.
Thanks, Garry. So from our previous versions, we came up with very stringent phantom acquisition and physics review protocols for each modality. And as we've gained feedback from our clients who have submitted images, we've tweaked those a little bit here and there. And as CMS has made comments, we've also changed those a little bit. And in our newest version, we actually only really made changes to the CT and MR components. The others kind of stayed the same. They pretty much adhere to what CMS is requiring and what we feel is the best for producing good quality images for those modalities. One slight change, which was mentioned earlier, is for nuclear medicine. We have actually gone to a quarterly phantom testing in-house, so the technologist can review the phantom images themselves and make sure that they are good quality images, but that needs to be done quarterly as a QC component. And then annually, obviously, the physicist will evaluate the phantoms as normal. So we do require routine physics testing. This needs to be done on an annual basis. When they're submitting to RadSite for accreditation, they need to submit the report. The report has to have no fails on it. If there is a fail on the report, then we need a subsequently follow-up report stating that the issue has been addressed and fixed, and the physicist now agrees that it's no longer a failed process. So for RadSite, there are phantom images that need to be submitted for each modality and an accompanying report for each modality. That's outlined in the standards. That really hasn't changed, except for some of our evaluation process has changed. Next slide. So some of the feedback that we received for CT was that our water standards of plus or minus 5 as a CT number was maybe a little too stringent. And as we've looked at it, and we've looked at the clinical images associated with these units who may had a CT number of slightly higher than 5 but less than 7, we see that clinical images are good, and we also agree that we can relax the standards to plus or minus 7 for the water CT number. As far as the other CT number values for the different phantoms, they remain the same. Again, if you do not recall, for CT, we allow the Gamex phantom, we allow the AAPM phantom, and we allow the CAT phantom. So any of those 3 can be submitted, and we'll evaluate the CT number depending on what material is in the phantom. And of course, we evaluate all the other parameters that meet our standards, like uniformity, high contrast resolution, low contrast resolution, artifacts, and such. So that was one of the changes in our CT standards. The other one that we had actually in our standards had suggested that the facility just use the image gently guidelines and submit their phantom acquisition, and they have to meet the dose requirements under image gently. That was a little bit complicated for some of the facilities to understand exactly what the threshold was for the dose protocols for the pediatrics. So although we required that the facility still adhere to the image gently guidelines, we actually simplified the submission process and stated that for a pediatric patient, you're looking at a 40-pound patient, and they have to meet the dose requirements for that. And so the dose requirements for that is a 10 milligray, a CTDI vol 10 milligray if the acquisition is using a 32 cm phantom, and it's a 20 milligray CTDI vol value if they're using a 16 cm phantom. And again, you should use the phantom that the vendor reports the dose on the unit. So if they report it, a CTDI vol based on a 16 cm phantom, you should acquire your dose phantom images using a 16 cm phantom as well. And the same applies for a 32 cm phantom. Next one. So for MRI physics, we set up the parameters initially that we did all the evaluation on the site T1 and site T2 acquisitions, assuming that they were transverse and they were spin echoes. Well, we realized that not all facilities use a spin echo as their site T1 or site T2. So we allow for an additional set of protocols, and those protocols we have a sagittal spin echo needs to be submitted, and its parameters would have a TR of 200 milliseconds and a TE of 20 milliseconds, slice thickness of 20 millimeters with no slice gap because there's only one slice. So that would need to be submitted. And then for an axial spin echo T1, a TR of 500 milliseconds, TE of 20 milliseconds, 11 slices for the JP phantom, and then the slice thickness and slice gap each would be 5 millimeters. And then also we allow for a dual echo T2 to be submitted, and the TR is 2,000 milliseconds with the TEs of 20 and 80 milliseconds, again with 11 slices, 5 millimeter slice thickness and slice gap. So for MR, we actually require 5 protocols be submitted. The sagittal spinnacle I described, the 2 site protocols being the 2 site axial protocols, and then the 2 additional ones, the spin echo T1 and the dual echo T2. This is consistent with what CMS requires for all accrediting bodies. So it should simplify the matters for the physicists. Again, they submit those 5 protocols, and we would evaluate the 2 site T1, the 2 site protocols first, the T1 and T2. And if they meet our standards, we would just do the sagittal and be done with the evaluation. If the site T1 and site 2 do not meet our standards, we would then go to these 2 additional protocols and evaluate those to see if they meet our standards. So hopefully that kind of simplifies it for the MRI component as well. There was no changes to the nuclear medicine or the PET component at this time, again, other than the quarterly QC requirements. Those are the updates for this version.
So Dr. Patton, just a quick question for you. After an applicant uploads the physics report and the related phantom images for a particular piece of imaging equipment, what happens if they're off on a couple of metrics? What does RadSite do in terms of providing feedback? Do we immediately fail the applicant, or how do we address situations where there's a deficiency?
So the most common deficiency that I see is the wrong images were submitted, or the physics report has an issue on it. So typically this occurs in CT more so than the other modalities, but the images may not be exactly what we call for. So then it's just, we notify Julie, Julie then notifies the applicant, and they have an opportunity to resubmit the correct images. They do not receive a pass-fail at that time. They just receive an incomplete, basically. Then the applicant resubmits what's missing or what needs to be corrected, and then the review process just continues as long as they respond to that over, a 2-week period or so. So I would reevaluate what was submitted, and if there's still a deficiency, I would notify Julie and say, hey, again, they did not submit the right images. They need to correct that. Then they can resubmit the appropriate images. If the images are all great and everything is submitted properly, but something fails, then it's noted that, hey, this parameter failed. The facility needs to address that, either call in service or have the physicist come back out and reevaluate and see what's going on, or recapture the images to see if they can actually get the parameter to pass. And then I wait for a resubmission to evaluate.
Great, that's very helpful. I mean, I think one of the things that RadSite is part of its value system, although our standards are rigorous, we do want to be educational. So we do have the feedback loops, and hopefully in most cases, an organization applying will make those adjustments to meet our standards, and obviously that's what we're set up to do. That being said, there are always organizations that struggle meeting our standards and ultimately have to withdraw or fail. But I'm excited by the fact that it's a two-way educational communication link, and in some cases we learn along the way too. So that's kind of one of the great things about the accreditation process. So I'm going to turn over to Julie, who's going to talk a little bit, just give a brief overview in terms of the accreditation review process, and kind of just some recent updates on things we've been up to. Julie.
Sure. Just
Garry, before Julie starts, I want to say you're correct. Part of our changes that were made was through this process of educating the facility and then getting feedback from the facility saying, hey, this is what we have, and maybe we should reevaluate our standard on that. So I think that is a good component of RadSite, where we have this educational process and open communication. All right, Julie.
Right, and just to finalize on what Dr. Patton said is if it gets to the point where me as the intermediary doesn't work, we will connect the physicist with the physicist so they can talk physics because they do understand each other and know where it's coming from, and that helps to educate as well. So to move on to the accreditation review process, our accreditation process has three parts: the admin part, or the desktop review, the image quality assessment review, and of course the physics review. Each part, as you know, is carried out by a qualified reviewer. For the image quality assessment, we are using practicing radiologists, and for the physics assessment, we use actual physicists. Once all three reviewers return passing reports, the accreditation manager puts together an executive summary of the application, and it is blinded and then presented to an independent accreditation committee, or AC. As required by CMS, we also carry out on-site audits. Although this year, due to COVID, they have been suspended, but we are looking at the possibility of adding a virtual on-site. Our goal through accreditation is to help make your practice more successful to you and your patients. Next slide. There are 4 stages to the portal: the preliminary stage, the in-process stage, the under review stage, and of course the accredited stage. In the preliminary stage, you will create your application. And this screen here, the image shows where you actually start the login process. It lets you register first at the bottom there so that you can move on into the the preliminary stage to create your facility and add your application. In the new 3.1 standards option, we have added those new modules that Dr. Siegel talked about. And so as you're adding a machine, you are also asked about what modules you would like to add. They are at your discretion. As an aid to starting the process, we will provide you with a portal tutorial and document checklist. I suggest that you have that tutorial open as you move through the portal. It gives you lots of pictures and step-by-step instructions. The checklist that we provide gives you a list of all the required documents in one place, and it gives you examples of what we're looking for, and it also references you back to the standards. There are also both of these documents are available once you log in the resources tab, which is on the left-hand side. It's a black column, and the little icon looks like a cog. But you'll also find in there the current standards and templates of job descriptions, as well as policies if you need that assistance. The in-process stage is the meat of the application. There you will find 6 tabs that you will need to complete. The first 3 tabs have questions about your facilities and your professional staff. We broke out the questions about your staff to a new tab called Personnel. We'll see that on the, actually, Garry, do you want to go to the next slide, please? There you go. So as you look across there, you can see the different tabs, the preliminary tab, the facility tab, the personnel tab, technologist tab, documents tab, scanner, and then studies. So those are what you have to fill out and complete. That documents tab, of course, is where you will upload all those required documents that the checklist helps you gather, as well as know what to expect with them. Once the application is completed, you will submit it for review. The accreditation manager will review it for completeness and then assign it to one of the 3 reviewers for the admin piece, the images piece, or the physics piece. If there are deficiencies, as we just discussed, we will notify you with an RFI and, if need be, reopen your application. You will then be able to review those issues and make any necessary edits or uploads. Once your application is approved by all 3 reviewers, an executive summary is created and, as I said, presented to our accreditation committee. The AC reviews the summary, and if your application passes their review, you will receive an approval letter and certificate. Your facility will also be listed in our online directory. And so if you have any questions, always feel free to contact me. We hope you've become more successful by undergoing the accreditation process. And if you see any way to help us, please let us know. Garry?
Well, thank you. And that's been very helpful. And I think that there's a lot to the accreditation review process and portal. It's a tool that you can, as Julie said, upload all your documents and actually keep them for the reaccreditation cycle too. So it's a tool that can be used in many different ways by the applicants in addition to just the current review process. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, and I know I've seen a couple questions come in, so I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. But Dr. Siegel, would you mind telling us a little bit about the cone beam CT accreditation standards that we've been developing for the past 2.5 years?
Sure, thanks, Garry. So over the last few years, there has been an explosion in the adoption across the country of cone beam CT technologies, and whether that's in dental offices or for musculoskeletal applications or for ENT applications, podiatry, maxillofacial imaging. And one of the things that's really important, as I mentioned, quality and safety, is that the CT technology that's utilized for cone beam CT is fundamentally different from the technology that's used for what might be now termed as conventional CT. And because of that, we believe strongly that there's a requirement for new standards, not only for who can operate these systems as far as technologists and interpreting them, which is a really important topic also, but just the basic ways of comparing radiation dose, comparing image quality. As many of you probably know already, cone beam CT does an incredible job of really high resolution imaging with an excellent modulation transfer function for cone beam systems in general. It doesn't do as well for low contrast discrimination, and cone beam CT also has some fairly specific applications in specific areas. And so the question is, could we develop a standard that took into account optimizing image quality and safety, being able to look at standardizing doses, and also looking at creating a mechanism to compare across different machines and to take into account the fact that these scanners are fundamentally different. And so our version of the standards currently is version 1.0, and in version 1.0, we're utilizing the recommendations from each of the cone beam manufacturers as the basis for accreditation. So if an FDA cleared manufacturer has a particular recommendation for testing and provides a phantom or recommendation for that process and has particular specifications, that is what is being tested currently in the cone beam realm. But I think what's really important is the idea of having uniform phantom testing, where in version 2.0, we move to the next level where we do the same thing we do with conventional CT and have a single phantom that can be utilized to compare quality across multiple different vendors and multiple different systems. One of the problems that, in my own opinion, is that the variability in quality in cone beam is much higher than variability in quality with conventional CT. And I think to a large extent, that's been because of the fact that there has not been a global testing process or a uniform phantom. And so being able to tackle, identify that problem, work with some of the experts in the world in that area to develop new standards and to develop that new phantom has been a really interesting challenge. And so we're hoping that we can get these out as quickly as possible so that we can raise the bar considerably and allow customers to be able to make determinations based on metrics that cut across multiple different systems. So that's just a nutshell summary, in a nutshell summary of where we're going with cone beam today and where we're planning on going really soon.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Browning, welcome back. Wanted to see if you wanted to chat a little bit about the National Alliance Initiative that RadSite's been helping co-lead over the past year.
Absolutely, thank you, Gary. So we've sort of begun and are participating very heavily in this National Alliance of Healthcare Purchasing Coalitions to work with large healthcare purchasers across the country to be able to create a more value-based system, if you will. In other words, so rather than pure volume or getting through as many patients as you can, look at other things that can be used to evaluate performance and also do things like control cost, reduce waste, improve quality. So we've been participating very heavily in this, and I think it's actually gaining quite a lot of traction. So the idea is that we provide questions that, you know, basically will help a health plan understand where they stand in terms of imaging quality and their relation to it. Many health plans don't have any approach to imaging quality right now. They just basically operate based on who the cheapest provider might be, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, who can do the organization of getting the patient in for them. Quality hasn't really come into play, nor has really performance and quality come into play yet. And we hope to change that. The whole idea is we're going to be defining and measuring performance and evaluating on an ongoing basis. And so we're discussing different ways we can do that. I mean, image exam metrics, what's the quality of the exam? How is it meeting clinical care requirements or requests? Imaging services, are patients being told to wait for quite a while? Are they getting in a relatively good fashion? Are they getting good performance reviews? Are patient reviews of the facility being taken into account? And then also looking at contracting. A lot of imaging these days is very, very dependent on appropriate contracting, but contracting is a very tricky business. So you can sign a contract that seems like it's very good, but it actually doesn't have any quality requirements. You end up actually putting out a relatively low quality, poor product. Contracting can be so onerous that your desire to achieve good performance for your patients and clinicians can't be met. You have to let something go because of the poor quality of the contract. So we hope to help out with that too, creating some degree of standards regarding contracting and standards regarding the quality of the imaging that is garnered by that contracting as well. Anything I missed, Gary?
Yeah, no, that's great. So what's interesting is that the evaluate's actually almost like an RFI. So National Alliance recently released a question set as part of this initiative to all the major health plans, which include things such as the physics testing that Dr. Patton talked about and the cone beam CT standards that Dr. Siegel talked about. So they'll be getting that information back, I think, towards the end of the first quarter. They've also drafted with our assistance an issue brief talking about some of these issues to make sure there's more of a qualitative approach by payers in terms of how they view imaging. So I think this is a classic example. Rising tide lifts all boats in terms of just trying to get the word out there. So RadSite's proud of the fact that we can kind of support, and in this case, educate employers and purchasers about some of the more important aspects of imaging. In a similar fashion, Dr. Siegel, you want to talk a little bit? We've just begun to support RSNA and their Quantitative Image Biomarkers Alliance. Do you want to talk a little bit about our efforts there?
Sure. So I'll be brief. You talked about raising all boats, and one of the important points is that one can have a scanner that is judged by Dr. Patton and others as being really high quality and meet all the accreditation standards, and yet measurements that are done, basic measurements such as lung nodule diameter or volume, or MRI flow characteristics, or diffusion characteristics, or PET SUV values, may actually differ significantly from one patient to the other. And the idea that one patient gets a scan with an SUV score of X and then goes to another facility 2 months later to figure out whether he's gotten better with chemo and radiation therapy and gets another value that may be a little bit different. The question is that a real difference, or is it just a difference from one machine to the other? And so the original work has been done on clinical trials, where we pay a huge amount of attention in clinical trials to making sure that machines are calibrated and will produce results that are consistent among different facilities and different machines. And so the KIBA effort, which is really important, extends that not only to research facilities, but clinical facilities, and creates specific recommendations and specific ideas about how one can actually not only have high quality systems, but high quality systems with reproducible measurements. And that's a really important effort that goes beyond where the efforts are currently of accreditation organizations. So it's been really fun to have the opportunity to work with RSNA and its other organizations that are part of the KIBA Alliance to be able to think about how we might be able to create either a special recognition or potentially eventually build this process of making sure that lab measurements from quantitative measurements and lab measurements from these machines are reproducible. So it's a really exciting new area that we're getting into. We'll see how that potential collaboration goes with RSNA and partners, but I think it's another indicator of how RadSite is looking to broaden our definition as patient advocates for being able to create actionable and diagnostic and high quality data. So thanks, Garry.
So one of the, we talked a moment ago about the feedback loops between the imaging provider that's going through the accreditation process and RadSite and vice versa. In the same way, you know, one of the privileges of being where we are as an accreditation organization is to really create feedback loops on public policy. So you've heard a little bit about this in the last few slides related to kind of the emerging cone beam CT technology and creating really the first national uniform standards for cone beam physics, for example. You know, we've just heard a little bit about the National Alliance, you know, working with employers. And as Dr. Siegel just mentioned, in terms of working with RSNA on this very important issue. In a like manner, you know, we need to have the very best methodology. So we've had a long-term relationship with Trajectory Healthcare, which kind of leverages comparative effectiveness. And we're going to roll out a series of studies in 2021 that really leverages the comparative effectiveness movement in those methodologies. One of the neat things about Trajectory is kind of creates these virtual epidemics and controls for the confounding variable of time. This is a study we did probably about 8 years ago on the clinical and financial efficacy of our old RadSite assessment program. But we're going to take some of this work and really begin to do some high quality research to kind of continue stimulating the public policy debate going forward. So I just want to kind of highlight that going forward. I know we only have a few more minutes, and I wanted to, I noticed a bunch of questions had come in through the chat box, and we'll definitely follow up with all those questions individually. But for example, Dr. Boyko he had raised the issue, and he's a committee member, about what RadSite's future is in terms of potentially qualifying machines to read images for artificial intelligence. So I thought that would maybe be a good kind of question about what are we thinking about kind of the automation of imaging practice, and in this case, you know, the kind of classic phraseology of artificial intelligence, and how do we get our hands around that. So I'll kind of open it up to all the speakers to see if they want to weigh in and put their 2 cents in.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll kick it off and just say that, you know, we mentioned that we do a review of human reports and a review of image quality. And I think that as we're moving forward with artificial intelligence applications, the FDA and the American College of Radiology and Organized Radiology are increasingly voicing concerns about making sure that as we move forward with our excitement about AI, which is, very genuine and, very, I think, realistic, to be excited about it, there's the potential to move forward too quickly and to essentially rely on manufacturer claims of efficacy, and the potential to be able to have as critical an eye on these AI applications as we do on radiologist qualifications and credentials and reports is something that will be important. I think an accreditation organization such as RadSite is in a really good position because it's really up RadSite's wheelhouse to be able to look at safety and efficacy and quality. And as these AI applications emerge, I think it's a great area to talk about. So thanks for the question. And I think that this in and of itself could certainly be a whole topic for a webinar.
Right.
But one other question that he had posed to me also that I'd just like to answer quickly is I want to be sure that I emphasize that when we talk about the fact that there's subspecialty recognition for spectroscopy and functional MR, that is our intent to essentially have standards and specifically look at functional MR and spectroscopy. When I had mentioned that we deleted a spectroscopy section, it was just a technical definition of spectroscopy and how it's performed that is quite dated, maybe 8 to 10 years old. So we just eliminated in our own standard this parenthetical definition and description of what spectroscopy is, but we have a really strong interest in functional MRI. We would just refer readers to up-to-date 2020 versions of the latest state-of-the-art technology rather than keeping an older definition of MRS because the technology is continuing to expand and grow. So again, thanks for the question.
Great. We're at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Of course, we love accreditation. We could talk about it all day long and maintain our excitement, but we have run the 60 minutes. Is there any final comments or observations any of the panelists would like to make before we wrap up?
Just me, I'd just like to say that it's important to understand that accreditation should be a dynamic and ever-changing and ever-evolving process. And I think, one of the things that we've all emphasized is the fact that it is changing, it is dynamic, it's not set in stone. It should have input from payors and input, from CMS and others, but the input should be really broad with patient input also. And the understanding is as the technology changes, as our understanding changes, as the environmental conditions like COVID, et cetera, change, that all of these need to be flexible, adaptable, and dynamic as time goes on. And for me, that's one of the real fun things about being involved with the accreditation process. So thanks.
Well, thanks. So I wanted to extend my thank you to each of you for participating. And for those of you who are in the audience, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We're here based in Annapolis, Maryland, and looking forward to your phone calls. The webinar will be posted. A link will be sent to you via email probably in about a week. So stay tuned for that if you want to re-listen to it or share it with other people. And we look forward to everybody have a good holiday season, and we'll hopefully chat with you in the next coming weeks or months. So thank you so much for participating on today's webinar on RadSite's version 3.1 standard upgrades. Take care. Happy holidays.